good morning, depending on the time zone, everyone. And welcome to this historical materialism broadcast. My name is Panagiotis Sotiris, and I'm an editorial board member of Historical Materialism Research and Critical Marxist Theory. And we are very happy to have this discussion today here with Ben Noys and Harrison Fluss. And this is a discussion on Ben's recent book, Crisis and Criticism, Literary, Cultural and Political Essays, 2009 and 2021, which came out with the Historical Materialism Book Series a couple of months ago, which means that in about less than 12 months, you will be able to find it in a more affordable form through Haymarket, and please do buy it. But also, if your institution can afford it, get your institution to buy the beautiful leather-bound Braille version. Ben is a professor of critical theory at the University of Chichester, and Harrison is an assistant professor in philosophy at St. John's University in New York. So the idea of this is you're going basically to see a conversation between Harrison and Ben. Ben will present the main arguments in the book. Then Harrison will go second, ask questions with the usual ruthless criticism we expect from any Hegelian Marxist worthy of such designation. Now, for all you viewers of this event, please, you can put your questions in the YouTube chat. I will relay them to the presenters, and then they will obviously answer them, and you can also be part of this discussion. And as usual, please do not forget to support the journal Historical Materialism by subscribing to it, which means at a very reasonable price, you will get 1,500 pages of state-of-the-art Marxist theory every year delivered to you by post. As already mentioned, if you are associated with an institution, please get your institution to subscribe, and also subscribe to the book series. And also, you can also get yourself through the books through Haymarket, our, let's say, partners in Marxist crime, in a sense, over the years. And yeah, depending on where you are staying, keep up. There's a series of excellent historical materialism conferences coming, beginning with La Grande Transition, the Great Transition, HM Montreal next week. End of June, the first Historical Materialism Paris conference. And please note that the CFP deadline for the London conference next November is still going on. It has been extended to the 27th of May. So please submit abstracts, and in general, come to London, come to the biggest probably Marxist conference in the Anglophone world, and I'm sure that you will never regret making such a choice. So I'm going to disappear now and give the floor, the digital floor, to Ben and Harrison.
Thank you. So thank you, Panagiotis. And I'd also like to start by thanking Sebastian Budgen, who invited me to publish the book, Crisis and Criticism. I will just say the Haymarket version is out. I don't have it to hand, so you can buy the more affordable version. I'd like to thank Alex Stoffel for organising the event, Panagiotis for the kind introduction and for chairing, and Harrison, of course, a friend of mine, in advance for his response and questions that will be semi-ambushing me later. So what I want to do then is give a kind of introduction to the book that hopefully won't take too long, about half hour. So I want to talk about how the book began. It began not only with an invitation, but with the opportunity that the invitation gave to me to make a kind of balance sheet or reflection on my work and over the period it was published. So the recent past, basically 2009 to the present. And obviously I became aware that the span of these essays was shaped by the global financial crisis of 2007 to 8 and its long-lasting after effects. And that's why I came to highlight crisis as a key word when I thought about the book. At the same time, as I explain in the introduction to the book, I think about these essays as critical interventions, critical discussions, using the tools of criticism, literary and otherwise, to think about and decipher this moment. So to decipher the discourse of crisis, because while crisis is felt immediately, I think understanding it and analysing it takes some work. So in that sense, the essays are removed. They're about a kind of cultural or critical discourse surrounding crisis. And also they're concerned with left thinking and left thinkers who shape this moment. So that's why the book is called Crisis and Criticism. The idea is crisis calls for criticism, and criticism helps us understand crisis. Also, I wanted to take the opportunity to reflect on the strengths and weaknesses of what I'd written in this period. I would say there is a new introduction to the book and conclusion, which if you read only one thing or two things, I'd suggest reading those. And I've also rewritten to some degree the essays, because what happened in that process of writing is a change or shift in the orientation of my thinking. And that's partly what I want to talk about today, to unpack a bit more clearly, to explain what I'm really doing with these two terms, crisis and criticism, if we think of them as kind of keywords in the Raymond Williams sense. So what I want to just do to start is set out that shift very sort of boldly, so it's clear to you, I hope, to unpack it in the rest of the talk. So to put it briefly, the initial concept of crisis I was talking about was about the crisis of the subjective capacity of the left. So while we had a global financial crisis, as many people have said, not least T.J. Clark, there didn't seem to be a kind of rebound of a significant sense to the left. And that obviously appears to have kind of got worse in recent years. So part of the concern with the essays were the possibilities and potentials of political subjectivity, which is why some of the essays are on Italian autonomous thinking, which has stressed political subjectivity, and communization theory, which has tended to stress a thinking of subjectivity as negation. Now, the problem that I identified in retrospect, looking back at this work, was that I had over-focused on the subjective dimension, perhaps influenced by some of the particular forms of political activity and inertia in Britain, where I live. The result was a risk of parochialism and the inflation of subjectivity as a solution to the crisis. In terms of criticism, the concept of criticism I initially developed, which was evident in another book I've written called The Persistence of the Negative, was of criticism as negation. Criticism was a work of corrosive negativity, revealing the contingency of all forms, ideological and otherwise. Such a conception of negativity was posed against affirmative thinking, which is thinking I associated with Nietzsche of the Great Yes. But the problem was that this criticism based in negativity was merely the inversion of that affirmative tradition. The result was a criticism that deliberately had no ground, and so could not really be described as materialist in any meaningful sense. It was closer to a pharaonic skepticism or to a negative form of Nietzschean genealogy. This conception of criticism as negativity also went along with a subjective form of thinking, in that the act of dissolving or criticizing became an act of will. The understanding of politics, therefore, was heroic and existentialist. So these were the starting points, and to further indicate what happened next, and save you reading the book, I wanted to shift to the consideration of the objectivity of crisis and the basis of criticism in material reality. This shift would be undertaken through a thinking of realism as proposed by the later Lukács, and with some prompting from Harrison. The importance of realism to the project is not that it is not just an aesthetic, I think, but it is a way of examining how thought emerges from and grasps material reality. Criticism, therefore, is no longer founded in contingency, but rather in the necessity of the development of freedom through the material productive forces and their contradictions. So all this might sound very classical and old-fashioned, and this is true. So my aim is not to be original, but to grasp reality and its tendencies, I think. So now I want to just briefly extend these sketch points, expand on them. So firstly, I want to talk about what I call the reality of crisis. So as I say, the initial thinking of crisis I was thinking about was founded on kind of political subjectivity and responses to crisis. But I think we need to move towards the thinking of the objective reality of crisis, and that reality is grounded in the contradictions of capitalism. Why did I not start from this? Of course, I thought I had, and thought the dimension of crisis that was most urgent was why hadn't this global financial crisis, this global capitalist crisis, produced any significant response, left response? I think we can see a parallel between my project and Peter Howard's project of the rehabilitation of the notion of political will. Both of us want to recover a subjective agency in a situation where it is apparently lacking. The objective reality of crisis was present, but it was rapidly, and I think too rapidly, replaced by a critical consideration of why that crisis had not produced the appropriate subjective response. In the lack of the sense of the objectivity of crisis also lay a lack of sense of the mediation of that objective crisis by subjectivity. And the result was that with that lack of mediation, the subjective rushed to fill in the gap and could only reproduce that gap. So there was a kind of gap between subjective will and desire and reality that this mode of critical thinking I was doing reproduced. What was of value, I think, in my work, when I republished it, was the criticism of the limits of the various responses to crisis, which tend to reproduce the same tensions of subjectivity. The critical discussions in the book of Italian autonomous thinking and communization remain, I think, and hope, important interventions. They lack, however, the fully incisive critical dimension that would have been given by a fuller consideration of the dialectic of the objective and subjective. So obviously, as Marx notes, life is generated and reproduced by collective production. And in the case of capitalism, this production generates its own objective dynamics that then shape subjective experience. One of the merits of Engels is to emphasize this fact in his discussion of the economic in the Anti-Düring, which draws on earlier arguments by thinkers like Mandeville and Adam Smith, who kind of formulate the very notion of economy as a domain in which the subject is not determinate. This objectivity of crisis is, however, never immediately present, which is something I argue in the book, no matter how violently and immediately its effects might be felt. The objectivity of crisis is real and mediated by ideology and by our responses to that ideological representation of reality. And it's at this level that crisis and criticism was an attempt at a response, to think through that ideological level. That is why questions of how we critically understand the world and crisis are crucial. Analyzing the discourses around crisis might appear secondary, and in some sense is, but these discourses are also always related to the reality and objectivity of society and nature. Ideology does not, I think, simply spin off into its own dimension, in which critical reading can only reflect on the fractures and tensions of ideology itself. I think this is too limited and gives too much power to ideology. So ideology is always in relationship to reality. Instead, ideology is shaped by reality. The reality that it aims to conceal and transfigure. The critical aim, therefore, is not just to read kind of in ideology, but to understand how ideology relates to reality. This is also true of crisis, which is a crisis in reality and in ideology. So to give an example, the contemporary discourse of polycrisis is symptomatic of the depth of the crisis in which we find ourselves, the multiple kind of crises going on, and is indicative of a failure to grasp how a crisis relates to a totality. Poly simply names a kind of problem of multiple crises. So polycrisis, I think, is a term that recognizes the multiplicity of the appearance of crisis, combined with an ideological failure to grasp the unity of crisis, its essence, in the crisis of capitalism. So that's why, returning to the book, I've increasingly returned to the category of realism, derived from the later Lukács. This is because Lukács's argument about realism as an aesthetic stresses the mediation of reality by subjectivity, along with the objectivity of that reality. Realism insists that there are better and worse representations of material reality, and the better the representation, the better we are able to grasp our situation. Of course, the fragmentations of capitalist society, which are intensifying as capitalism lurches from crisis to deepening crisis, obscure the reality of that society. Realism is about a thinking of totality, not just the totality capitalism produces, which creates a global production, but one that blinds us to our role in it. Instead, totality is a thinking that transcends capitalism, as capitalism itself must be transcended by human control. And totality becomes something in which we can grasp the relationship between humans and nature. Lukács, like Marx, uses the word metabolism, which are not reducible to capitalist social relations. It is the thinking of totality that allows us to think beyond the limits of contemporary alienation and fragmentation. So polycrisis makes sense of the immediate experience of multiple and overlapping crises, as we doom scroll on any given day at the moment, as I seem to do every morning. But it does not make sense of the unified and linked forms of this appearance of crisis in the current totality. Thinking from the fragmentation of the present allows us to recognize that fragmentation, but without a thinking of totality, we cannot think the real essence of the present situation. So crisis and criticism does carry out a necessary critical task in the analysis of the limits of existing discourses. And I've tried to reinforce this through some rewriting to eliminate some of the subjectivist tendencies of the analysis and to restore a sense of realism as a critical tool that gives us a way of thinking material reality dialectically. Some of the criticisms of left thinkers in the book could have been sharpened further along these lines. As we will see, however, the focus on limits, which is a Kantian focus, needs to be reworked to think about origins and essence, how crisis lies in reality, and how criticism works from its own reality as well. We are still left with the issue with which I began this discussion of crisis, the crisis of the left and left subjectivity. This is something we, by which I mean a collective we, need to return to. It has recently been given a sharper form in Jodie Dean's book, Capital's Grave, where the failure of the left is seen as paving the way for a neo-feudalism beyond capitalism. In contradiction to that argument, I think I would argue that this is still capitalism, trying and failing to resolve its own contradictions. The thinking of the objectivity of crisis is part of the critical task of building and developing collective agency. This is certainly true, as this is a process of collective knowledge as a means to develop that collective agency. It is to point towards the traditional problem and necessity of the party form as collective mediation of capitalist society and as production of knowledge as well as collective agency. The fragmentations and alienations of the present, including, as I noted in Crisis and Criticism, a kind of surfeit or excess of anti-communist ideology, work against this collective need for a disciplined party form that would provide a framework of understanding and the ability to contest crisis. This necessity is something that, alongside the necessity of thinking the reality of crisis, could have been more strongly developed in the book. So my second consideration is criticism. So as I said, my mode of criticism shifted over a period of writing these essays and working on the revised book. The initial mode of criticism was one that relied on negativity as something that dissolved all positivity and all illusions. The suggestion was that the revelation of contingency would expose the form of ideological illusion. An obvious problem is that this also dissolves the basis of critique itself. In the absence of a basis of critique, the act of criticism becomes one of existential self-assertion, and within this negativity lurks the affirmation of the individual ego. This ego might be couched in collective terms or in terms of a representative of the collective, but the problem remains. If everything is contingent and historical, then we cannot even get started with the project of knowledge and rational understanding. While all discourses get dissolved, so does the discourse articulating that dissolution. And one can think here of all the paradoxes of the discourses of anti-philosophy and non-philosophy, which did tempt me and I have kind of engaged with. The result is not only existential, but also a kind of solvent empiricism in which knowledge is only ever in process and never stabilized. We might summarize the problems in a very famous phrase from Marx, which Panegyrius gestured towards in his letters to Ruger: ruthless criticism of the existing order, or ruthless criticism of all that exists, as it's sometimes translated. Now, I want to suggest that this might be an equivocal formulation. We can see how it might be misread, as I would argue, in a more Nietzschean mode that dissolves all positive formulations. So ruthless criticism of all that exists, in that translation, seems to imply there is no kind of grounding. There could be a confusion between Nietzschean critique and Marxist critique. And Domenico Lussurdo, I think, makes clear the difference between Nietzsche and Marx in their modes of ideology critique. Nietzsche wants to expose illusions of all sorts and force a confrontation with reality. He was also well aware of the dimension of slavery in the forced labor of modern capitalism. The difference with Marx is that Nietzsche wanted this slavery to continue so as to create a new elite. Nietzsche wanted to tear off ideological images, but only to justify wage slavery and caste slavery. Nietzsche's attitude was one in which critique exposed beautiful illusions, but reveled in the acceptance of brutal reality. Lussurdo calls Nietzsche's critique a meta-critique, designed to dissolve revolutionary thought. While Nietzsche makes use of science, often reactionary sciences that are proto-eugenic, he dissolves science and rationality into his own political project of aristocratic radicalism. This is the irony. Nietzsche's project is more political than that of Marx, according to Lussurdo. Nietzsche is, for Lussurdo, a totus politicus, and this is one reason for the irrational nature of his criticism, which lacks a consistent basis except the need to execute this political demand for a new party of life and the restoration and reinvention of hierarchy. My own form of critique also risks this over-politicization due to the lack of a sustained reflection on the basis of critique. Marx, in contrast, saw ideology as a complex registration of the legitimation and transfiguration of existing oppression. The point was not to tear away ideology to leave us with naked force, but to see how ideology registered social conflicts and contradictions. There was also a critique in the service of change, which aimed at the progress of human freedom. Marx constantly distinguishes his critical work from the type of cynical criticism, later exemplified by Nietzsche, which constantly exposes the reality of violence and hierarchy only to celebrate it. So, as Lussurdo points out, there have been no shortage of critics of capitalism who kind of revel in its violence, what we could call a kind of grimdark vision. Gramsci, cited by Lussurdo, contrasts a progressive sarcasm, which questions only the immediate forms of revolutionary demands, so Marx's kind of critique of other revolutionaries, and a sarcasm of the right, which is always negative, skeptical, and destructive. In Marx, the thinking of rationality, laws and tendencies, science, and the real capacities of the human grounds a critique that never falls into that total cynicism. This suggests that alongside an understanding of the objectivity of crisis, we might grasp the objectivity of criticism as well. Criticism is not only a matter of destructiveness and not only a matter of tracing limits. This is the Kantian and Nietzschean matrix in which so much criticism and critique lives. It can be radically historicizing as well, as in Foucault, but it loses any relationship to historical reality in its emphasis on the contingency of all forms of knowledge. Reality becomes, as Nietzsche suggests, a matter of signs, and signs linked to reality figured as brutal reality. Therefore, we have a mode of criticism and critique which combines an extreme attention to signifying surfaces, along with, as I've said before, a grimdark conception of historical and contemporary reality, most visible in Foucault's introductions to his books. As Maurice Blanchot astutely recognized, quote, "One suspects somehow that Foucault would prefer the openly barbarous times when torture hid nothing of its horror," end quote. In this, as in so many other ways, Foucault remains Nietzschean. This is why I suggest rethinking criticism in the mode of realism. This is, of course, a materialist criticism, which could have been emphasized more, but this is why it is realist. Realism in this sense is about understanding and grasping the dynamics of reality as the basis of our thinking and criticism. As Lenin states, summarizing Marx's thought, by examining the totality of opposing tendencies, by reducing them to precisely definable conditions of life and production of various classes of society, by discarding subjectivism and arbitrariness in the choice of a particular dominant idea or its interpretation, and by revealing that, without exception, all ideas and all the various tendencies stem from the condition of the material forces of production, Marxism indicated the way to an all-embracing and comprehensive study of the rise, development, and decline of socio-economic systems. This is the basis of criticism, no longer simply lies in negation, but negation as sublation and understanding of the objective tendencies of development and the decline of the material forces of production, or their rise. Certainly, this might return us to multiple debates which have played out across the 20th and 21st centuries, but I think this basis must also be defended and not displaced by subjectivism and arbitrariness. So that's where I'm at with criticism. So just to conclude, I want to try and put crisis and criticism back together again. So to put them back together again, crisis and criticism is to put together the objectivity of crisis, grounded in the reality and contradictions of capitalism, including its necessary movement into crisis and its inability to resolve crisis successfully, except temporarily, and the objective basis of critique in human equality, the science of grasping the contradictions of capitalism and its inevitable collapse, and a metaphysical understanding of humans as involved in collective self-production and reproduction with nature, of which we are a part. That, stated most broadly, I think, is what we collectively need to achieve. Of course, all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty Dumpty back together again. I think we can, however, transform the conditions under which we exist to put back together not only crisis and criticism, but to transcend the necessity and forms of capitalist crisis and the criticism of capitalism. So not just to remain within the capitalist horizon, if we like. This is why, which is something I did not clearly see, Marxism goes beyond any limits, and I think is a worldview. This is an unpopular view, much criticized, but I think, in fact, it is. It is a worldview because it grasps the world as a totality, understood by laws and according to necessity. It is not a militant science, or it's not just a militant science. It's not a partial knowledge, just a partial knowledge. It is not just ideology critique or negative dialectics or Kantian criticism or pragmatic intervention or only a science of the oppressed. I think it is more than all of these because it goes beyond the limits of class society. Its historicism is not the historicism of the restriction of things to conditions as they are, but the tendencies and development of human freedom. And of course, that freedom in metabolism with nature. Marxism is not modest. It is not something that just exists in the marketplace of ideas, or even, as Fischer Jameson suggested, as the key to that marketplace. It is beyond the marketplace, beyond capitalist society. And to think this, I think, is the task that confronts us. This is a beyond that is not dwelling on the limit or a brief glimpse of some outside or some weird reality, but a beyond in a sense of a moment that is what transforms our understanding of our own reality. And I think that is where putting back together crisis and criticism can get us. So I'll conclude there and I will pass over to Harrison for his response. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was terrific. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. So I want to thank the HM organizers and to thank Ben for inviting me to respond to his work. I have wanted to talk publicly about Ben's contributions for over a decade of knowing him, and it's a real pleasure to finally do so in this setting. My talk for such an intervention was originally conceived years ago with a rather Arendtian-sounding title. It was supposed to be called Marxism in Dark Times, the Critical Theory of Benjamin Noys. I have always thought that Ben's work is crucial for analyzing and evaluating contemporary ideological trends. This is especially true of accelerationism, a word Ben coined and repurposed from sci-fi to describe the thinking of post-68 French Nietzscheanism. This would include Deleuze's Anti-Oedipus and Lyotard's political, a libidinal economy, the primary texts of this accelerationist position. And the basic idea is that the contradictions of capitalism should be affirmed and radically exacerbated to finally overcome capital itself. This would produce a kind of apocalyptic rupture with all economic and political stagnation, transcending our world and even our humanity, towards some kind of antinomian outside. The accelerationist point then is not to escape hell, but to go deeper into it until you break on through to the other side. Someone once said that Ben invented the disease of accelerationism that he wanted to cure, but that's of course not true. Accelerationism, or the idea of affirming and exacerbating the alienation of humanity to achieve otherworldly goals, is as old as class society itself and goes back to the ancient myths of titanic gods using ordinary folks as playthings for their grand designs. One could even consider the Book of Revelation as a kind of proto-accelerationist fantasy where things must get much worse before the total victory of Christ is achieved. But in its distinctly capitalist form, or rather imperialist form, Nietzsche deserves the title of being the first modern accelerationist thinker. In Nietzsche's later writings, he calls for an acceleration of nihilism and decadence to make way for a new breed of aristocrats to supplant mass society. One would think such accelerationism is prima facie incompatible with leftist ideas of egalitarianism and human needs, but that did not stop generations of thinkers from trying to yoke together what George Lukács called right-wing epistemology and left-wing ethics. And when Ben came up with this diagnosis in his book Persistence of the Negative in 2010, Mark Fisher explicitly took up the accelerationist label, not as anything harmful, but as something to be championed, even going so far as to brand himself a left accelerationist. It's worth returning to Fisher's presentation at Goldsmiths in 2010, where he claims that Marxism is either accelerationist or it is nothing, that in our current theoretical and political dispensation, we need a kind of synthesis between Nick Land and Karl Marx. For Fisher, coming out of Nick Land and Sadie Plant's Cybernetic Culture Research Unit, Land is the far-right Nietzsche of our times. However, in 2025, it doesn't seem that the accelerationist label has had much staying power on the left, academia, or para-academia for that matter. The label has become semantically disastrous, covering out everything from fully automatic luxury communism to tepid social democratic nostalgia about old labor and the New Deal to neo-reaction and even fascist terrorism. But that does not mean accelerationism, as Ben originally described in Persistence of the Negative or in his book Malign Velocities from 2014, went away. Accelerationism is part of a broader trend of indirect apologetics for capitalism, which romanticize growth and austerity over and against human needs. These inhuman processes of accumulation are not only seen as desirable, but as preeminently revolutionary. As Nick Land put it succinctly in one of his polemical rants against Marxism that you can find in his collection of writings, Fang Noumena, capital is revolutionary, but humanity is a drag. As for left-wing accelerationism, the far-right Land once responded as follows, quote, "The notion that self-propelling technology is separable from capitalism is a deep theoretical error. A self-propelling technology, divorced from human nature, turns humanity into mere scaffolding, a tool for the machine. For instance, the prospect of AI displacing large portions of the human workforce is only the latest iteration of this threat. Of course, technology does in principle promise more freedom. In fact, it is the extension of our human reason, but under capitalist social relations, it can also reinforce systems of domination and express the very alienation of reason." How did Ben confront accelerationism? What were the resources of his critique in Persistence and Malign Velocities? While the affirmationist currents in continental philosophy embraced power, activity, and excess, he posited the need for negativity, critique, and determination. All of this put Ben on the side of dialectics, as opposed to the Nietzschean Deluzian consensus that dialectics was merely reactive, a dead dog, or an ideological Trojan horse for authoritarian Stalinism. Ben noticed that this affirmation of what is irreducible to reason came back in speculative realism and the proliferation of new or weird materialisms that went beyond a determinate conception of matter. As Ben put it, quote, what is affirmed is the irreducibility of the object to capture, an excess or power of objects to escape the forces and forms of abstractions. The negativity that Hegel and Marx once wrote about was then cast aside as, quote, extraneous, as something at best added in by the subject and not consonant with a rich object world which affirms itself without the need for humans. But what of Ben's return to negativity in persistence and malign velocities? As we said above, Ben posited the need for critique, but he eventually saw that negativity cannot be just an assumption or a subjective choice we make, like a Kierkegaardian leap of faith into Marxism. Instead, we need to return to a more determinate grasp of negativity, or to see negativity not as a mere political position, but as part of the dialectics of reality itself, in nature and history. However, this isn't just a simple negativity anymore, but what Hegel, Marx, and Engels called the negation of the negation. It is seeing things from the perspective of the totality or the rational whole. Ben has pointed out that an abstract and subjective idea of negation is also related to more concrete problems of politics and revolution. If the forces of negativity are not rooted in real historical struggle, then there is a lurking danger of pessimism, which often opts for reformism, if not downright despair. This kind of negativity afflicted members of the Frankfurt School, and it's not a coincidence that such negativity became indistinguishable from a tacit acceptance of the status quo. The Grand Hotel Abyss that Lukács wrote about is not so much a retreat from bourgeois society, but rather one of its finest resorts. As Ben made clear this evening, he has returned not just to the later Lukács of critical realism, but also the concerns of Lukács's classical Marxism. These include the concepts of totality, dialectics, materialism, and the critique of political economy. Ben is aware of Lukács's compromises with Stalinism, but that does not prevent him from separating the Marxist wheat from the Stalinist chaff. As a species of irrationalism itself, Lukács also came to criticize Stalinism as a bureaucratic ideology that reduced strategy to tactics. This critique is similar to Trotsky's own understanding of Stalinist ideology as Bonapartist pragmatism. And when Lukács called Stalinism hyper-rationalist, he did not mean to criticize reason itself, but to show that Stalinism was ultimately pseudo-rational in its presentation and not an authentic expression of Marxism. In many ways, Ben's conceptual odyssey parallels Lukács's own philosophical trajectory. If Ben emerged from a intellectual formation steeped in the surrealism of Bataille and the deconstruction of Derrida, then Lukács's path towards a more classical Marxism broke from the influence of German existentialism and Kierkegaard. Indeed, Ben acknowledges that his initial critique of affirmationism was marked by a Kierkegaardian or Fichtean dimension, with negativity as grounded in a more existential dialectics. Kierkegaardian and Fichtean are the same labels Lukács used to describe his early works, such as the theory of the novel from 1914. We still need more satisfactory accounts of how the early Lukács relates to the later Lukács, and not a work that simply posits some unintelligible rupture between the existentialist phase and the Marxist one. I think that Ben can provide such an account because his intellectual career has grappled with similar philosophical contradictions, if not some of the exact same contradictions. Ben's path to realism, like Lukács, is mediated by his engagement with Lenin. This is Lenin not simply as a Marxist leader of the October Revolution, but Lenin as a serious Marxist philosopher. Ben's recent piece on realism that came out for the journal Crisis and Critique contains a deep appreciation of Lenin's essays on Leo Tolstoy and on Lenin's critical embrace of Tolstoy's fiction as a mirror of Russian reality. This idea that consciousness can reflect reality in its complex orders and connections is not only the source of scientific knowledge, but is also the main source of human creativity in art and culture. Creativity is just a buzzword or something mysterious and ineffable if it is not connected to a grasp of what's rational and real, and there's nothing more creative than reality itself. So, does all this mean that Ben has become, in his own way, an affirmationist of reality? I'm tempted to say yes, although it's not the same affirmationism of Nietzsche and Deleuze. Instead, it affirms the Hegelian Marxist program that the real is rational and the rational is real, that dialectical negativity is a feature of one monistic reality that operates according to universal and, in principle, knowable laws of motion. And while Ben is still, in some key respects, a critical theorist, I think he has moved on from mere critique as such towards classical Marxism, including the very unfashionable idea that Marxism is a worldview. This move of Ben's from negation to second negation, or mere critique to the idea of a worldview, was made possible by his suspicions of Nietzsche. Nietzsche famously said we need to be ware of all systematizers, and I think that injunction has prevented much of contemporary philosophy from thinking coherently about the whole. I also think it's fair to say that Domenico Lacerdo's book on Nietzsche, The Aristocratic Rebel, helped catalyze Ben's move towards the later Lukács and classical Marxism. As Ben said, Marxism is not just another idea in the marketplace. I agree, Marxism is totalizing, but without being totalitarian. It's monistic, but without being a cosmist and woefully abstract. Its demands do not suffer from false modesty. To paraphrase James Connolly, it only wants to know and change the world. But we cannot change things without philosophy, and without a philosophy that can give us genuine knowledge about the world. Ben's Marxism is not just for dark times. It's also for the future times, what Marx called the realm of freedom. It's for a world that is no longer tormented by poverty, exploitation, genocide, alienation, and our inhumanity towards each other and towards the planet. The promise of Marxist philosophy is knowledge and a rational comprehension of our situation. To understand is to be free, and this is the theoretical basis of the Marxist slogan that insight into necessity is freedom. If we have this understanding, we do not have to give in to the final ideology, which is despair. Brecht said, in the contradictions of capitalism lies hope, but it's not mere hope if we have knowledge which can lead us past these contradictions. It's not a Pascalian wager or a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. It's a scientific prediction that the darkness is temporary, that the present is pregnant with the future, and that in the long arc of history, emancipation is coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you. So thank you for all the kind words and the summary. Probably better than I can do of my own project. Reminded of the Lacanian idea of the pass, where you kind of pass your own experience into someone else's hands, and they kind of summarize it to a kind of jury. So you kind of experience a weird alienation from your own experience and a reflection of it back. So yes, I mean, I think you kindly summarize. I mean, I hope I'm doing those things. I think that is still, like some of the tensions of the project that I'm outlining is that it leaves lots of elements that you suggested to be developed or redeveloped, because obviously a lot of this is already kind of going back to things that have been done. But also at the same time, obviously, that does mean returning to the debates and issues that marked those earlier kind of experiences, as we've discussed. I mean, the kind of strange reappearance of a kind of phantasmatic Stalinism in the wonderful world of social media, I think is one indication of unsettled business and unsettled debates, which is why it's so important in regard to a thinker like Lukács, or any thinker, but particularly a thinker like Lukács, because of his involvement, is to understand at once their relationship to actual Stalinism rather than phantasmatic Stalinism, and the ways in which they can offer critical resources and debates that go beyond both Stalinism as an actual social formation and this recurrence of a kind of phantasmatic Stalinism, which I see as really ironically kind of Nietzschean in a sense. It's a fetishization of power, you know, the whole, even the discourse which we were talking about before we came on, of like the tanky, is a fascination for material power. You know, it's one would not take much to kind of do a, you know, which I think there is a role for psychoanalysis at times in this, you know, a kind of psychoanalytic / Marxist analysis of the way in which situation of relative powerlessness leads to fantasies of power, which are projected back through fantasies about state violence. So again, in this case, it's weirdly Nietzschean in that what gets celebrated in this is the worst of Stalinism. You know, it's like the people, you know, the adoption of that kind of view at the present is a, you know, a literal adoption of the most extreme forms of violence, the camps, executions, liquidations. You know, these become kind of jokey tropes in the hands of the present. So I think, you know, it's kind of going beyond the impasses of the present does require a kind of working through, a positive working through of those elements of the tradition that we kind of, I think, too rapidly considered done and dusted in one way or another. Yeah, that's why, as I think you rightly draw attention to, a figure like Lukács is so fascinating, and why we've both also done some work in kind of reading Lukács not just as he often is positioned as a sort of precursor to the Frankfurt School, history and class consciousness as his only work, but transcending that to understand why he writes like his later work on realism, and why that later work isn't just Stalinist, and why that work is also addressed to critical problems. Like you say, there are critical problems in the early Lukács about his existentialism, which he recognizes his embrace of the tragic. But there are also, as he says, you know, problems with history and class consciousness. You know, history and class consciousness is Fichtean view of the party, its own kind of failure to grasp totality, its own still a kind of Bolshevik subjectivism, which is why Lukács's kind of acceptance of some of the criticisms of history and class consciousness is not just a compromise with Stalinism or a fear for his life, although those factors were involved, but is also a recognition of the impasses of that book, which I then think the fact that that book is then kind of isolated and treated as like the good Lukács that can then feed into a tradition without seeing that book more critically and more positioned, I think we lose some of the ways that we could, that book has its own influence as well. And those tendencies of subjectivism and the kind of get reproduced in later critics who would say that they're going beyond Lukács, so the Frankfurt School kind of arguments. You know, they would say, well, the problem with Lukács is he believes in the party. That's what's wrong with history and class consciousness. Whereas, in fact, Lukács would kind of agree, well, to the extent what's wrong with history and class consciousness is the way the party is presented in a very subjectivist way as a kind of solution to an historical dialectic, which is partly to do with the experience of the Russian Revolution. You know, it's to do with the fact that the party does do something extremely important. So I think there is a definite need to kind of return to those debates and work them through, which I've only, I hope I can do, only just begun, as they say, as the song goes. And also on that note, I think one of the ways, I was just thinking as you were talking, that we could think about that continuity is through the notion of life, because partly I've just written a book on it, but you do see the way life figures throughout Lukács's writing. You know, that from beginning to end, you know, you could argue that in some ways some of the tensions we're talking about between the subjective and the objective, the existential and historical understanding of freedom, are kind of reproduced within his own desire to kind of understand, grasp life, within his own struggle to kind of think about life, not just in relationship to humans, but in relationship to kind of nature or animality or metabolism. So I wonder, you know, if after I write a book, I've already written a book on life, but after I write a book about realism, there is also another book to be written, or an argument to be made around Lukács's kind of thinking about non-alienated life. I think that would be one way to kind of answer your point about the continuities in his career. I think that's a strong and important kind of continuity, and also a kind of strong thing to think about today, because one of the signs of the present, of like capitalist decadence, like if you want to call it that, which I would, is that we struggle to imagine anything like non-alienated, anything healthy, anything possible. Those words have become kind of tainted. We celebrate in a sense illness. We celebrate kind of, in some good ways, in the sense to kind of help people and understand them, but also in some problematic ways, as people like Susan Sontag have pointed out. So I think, in a sense, the struggle with the concept of life that Lukács undergoes might be something that we could kind of, one way we could think the future. But I do know, as Panagiotis has pointed out, we don't have questions from outside, although do feel free to post them. But Harrison does have some questions for me as well, so we can do move on to the kind of Q&A, starting with you, Harrison.
Okay, let me just check the chat.
Sure.
Yeah, so I have quite a few questions. I do think, going back to Lukács, it would be good to tease out what he thinks about the dialectics of nature, not just in History and Class Consciousness, where he rejects it, but also later on. And that might be able to unlock some issues regarding what he thinks about life. So relating it to, does he really believe in the dialectics of nature? He seems to affirm it to some extent in Taylism in the dialectic, where he's defending History and Class Consciousness against de Boeren, but seems a little ambiguous there. And what's his relationship later on with Lenin's Materialism, Imperial Criticism too. But in terms of going back to your crisis and criticism essays, I want to talk a little bit about your intellectual formation. So it's originally shaped by Bataille, Derrida, and it seems even early on you were opposed to the intellectual formation of deluzianism. So I want to ask, in what way were you adverse to deluzianism? In what ways is that consistent? Is this connected with an earlier affinity that you have with deconstruction? And also, why in the book do you think that deluzianism is this persistent ideology coming into the 21st century even?
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I've always, like you say, been shaped by two things, Bataille and Derrida. So in one understanding of both, there is a thinking of negativity. So I think that's one reason for a distinction between what I've been trying to do in Deleuze, because Deleuze tends to associate his thinking with a positivity or arguments against negativity, like he takes from Bergson. So I often thought there was a kind of lack of that discussion within Deleuze's thinking. I guess also I was thinking one of the important things that Derrida did that might be a continuity in my thinking is emphasize the role of philosophy. Well, Derrida is often, and you would be right to argue, can be taken as an anti-philosopher or a kind of critique of philosophy, which he does. He also does affirm the irreducible kind of need for philosophy, particularly like in his essays on Levinas, where Levinas invokes the sort of total other. And Derrida says, well, that just doesn't make any sense. How can you have something completely other to rationality? It doesn't really make sense. And in his other essays, like when he defends Descartes against Foucault's misreading. So I think one of the things that was kind of floating in the back of my mind always was that that importance of philosophy to someone like Derrida, which is obviously in his case a kind of Husserlian kind of inheritance. So I think, as I've joked before, the importance about philosophy is, it's kind of go big or go home. It has to be a total discourse. It has to be something that kind of understands reality. Otherwise, why bother with a seemingly kind of modest or minor discourse? Other things could do that. So philosophy has to do something like that. Coming back to Deleuze, there'll be plenty of people out there who will argue, Deleuze is a philosopher, more of a metaphysician, but I think I just always had a skepticism about the Deleuzian articulation of those problems. I think now, when I've read more and I understand more about his work, he comes from a kind of spiritualist tradition, Maine de Baran, Bergson, very French tradition. I think that tradition, as he kind of articulates, is critical of dialectics, critical of negativity. Obviously, again, people will say he was going to plan a book on Marx called The Grandeur of Marx. He does at various points obviously engage with Marx and Marxism. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Deleuze doesn't do kind of things that are interesting, but I think some of the kind of baseline kind of commitments of his thinking are ones that block him from being a dialectical thinker or grasping negativity or grasping totality, except within a very different kind of tradition. The provocation, that he's an ideologist of the present is, I suppose, in the one hand, just thinking that using Deleuzian description is very hard to avoid in describing the present. Deterritorialization and reterritorialization, for example, are very appealing ways to think about the way, like the current Trump regime operates. On the one hand, abandoning everything to the marketplace, exposing everything, kind of wrecking things. On the other, re-territorializing around the father, the state, authority, power, the kind of daddy Trump fantasy world of MAGA. So there's a level of kind of diagnostic and a level of the description of things like desiring machines and that stuff, which I think seems to reflect the social reality that we have. What I would say now, by coming back to realism, is that reflection is a reflection of the surface appearance of that reality, not its kind of essence. So I think that's what I would say is why it is ideological, is that it cannot really grasp, I don't think, the underlying dynamics of that process.
Well, going back to accelerationism, do you see accelerationism more as a philosophy, an ideology, a cultural trend, an aesthetic, or something even quasi-theological? How does accelerationism relate to capitalism and late capitalist dynamics? And even if accelerationism seems to be a dirty word these days, in what way is our historical present still accelerationist?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have this sort of perverse interest in, once things happen, is understanding why they had an appeal. So why, my writing on accelerationism is like, why do people find these ideas interesting? People engage with these things, they want to engage with them. And then when people abandon those ideas, which is what happened with accelerationism, everyone's like, no, we're moving on. I kind of have an interest in, well, isn't there something there? Why have you just abandoned these ideas if you thought they were so powerful and interesting? So I find myself kind of, if you like, kind of interested in still thinking about the persistence of them. I mean, we only have to take a phenomenon like, AI or large language learning models to say, debates about the use of technology, the acceleration of technology, the distribution of technology, the control over technology have hardly gone away. You would feel that this would be, exactly the kind of ground in which accelerationists would be kind of intervening all the time. It's like, where is the accelerationist response? There might be one, because somewhere out there's something, I'm sure, to LLMs and to this kind of stuff. So I guess at that level, I still think accelerationism named a kind of problem, that problem you mentioned in the paper, where Land says technological development cannot be separated from capital, and to imagine so is naive. I mean, that does name a problem that the accelerationists, I think, were not wrong to point to. Is a problem of how we analyze revolution, how we analyze, Marxist transition and change. Is like, how much of that change is predicated on capitalism and its technologies and its development. In revolutionizing that, how much do we accept or change? How much are technologies shaped by capitalist society? How much would they have to be changed to serve the needs of the mass of humanity, to serve the needs of, humans in a someone's asking the question, a non-alienated way? What would that mean? So I don't think, as I said, back in Malign Velocities, I think, although I focus, I think, a bit too much around the problem of labor there, but, I think accelerationism wasn't asking like a completely stupid question. It was asking a question that is kind of still with us, as the kind of technological stuff, we're on it now. I'm using it. The technological detritus, I don't know about you, but I seem to have like a stack of dead devices that I can't get rid of. These things are kind of surrounding us. So there's that level, I think, where it's still necessary. And of course, as you know, we're seeing more and more around the current debates around what we're going through, whether it is fascism or not, to what relationship to historical fascism does it have? You know, accelerationist ideology, particularly obviously in its Landian or reactionary form, we explicitly took a kind of Italian futurist, I would argue, heritage as its model, you know, so kind of developed from something that itself was the roots of a certain kind of fascist ideology. So again, I think there is something to kind of think about the relationship of technology to that kind of conjuncture, you know, that kind of debate. So yeah, my ironic argument, again, like you said, you know, the disease, spreading the disease I'm trying to cure, you know, I ironically or unironically think that there is still something within the debates that accelerationism triggered that actually does still need to be kind of sorted out or discussed. I don't think, you know, as we've talked about, you know, Trotsky's response to like Russian futurism or Italian futurism, Lenin's response to Soviet avant-garde, you know, there again, we're talking about debates that I think have recurred and not been kind of settled and might be worth revisiting.
So, related to a more metaphysical question, to transition from accelerationism to this broader category of affirmationism, you criticize this as philosophically one-sided. Can you define a bit more what you mean by affirmationism, and in what ways do you remain a proponent of dialectical negativity?
Yeah, I guess what struck me back when I wrote Persistence of the Negative was the way in which a lot of thinkers who in some ways were engaged with kind of thinking about negativity, and or in the case of someone, certainly someone like Badiou or, you know, Negri, like a kind of dialectics, seemed at the same time to have a fundamental commitment to a kind of affirmative moment and seemed to kind of rely on that to do some kind of work in their thinking. You know, it seemed to be the one thing, almost to me, like a kind of added appendage. I didn't really understand why. You know, why do you have to begin from an affirmative moment as a kind of condition of what you're doing? It seemed like a way of holding on to something. So, you know, that kind of got me thinking about what tied a whole tradition of thinkers that might seem like opposed to each other. Like I say, Negri and Badiou rowed all the time in public about what they thought about communism and politics. You know, Bruno Latour would have like nothing to do with any of the other people I said about, you know, regarding them all as kind of weird lefties, you know, whereas he's kind of talking about science. So a bit like I've done with the Life book, really, bringing together people who might seem very different, but I think share some fundamental commitment. Metaphysically, yeah, I mean, this is something I need to kind of work on, but, you know, as we've talked about, you know, I think the alternate tradition of the Hegelian beginning from something that like being, but that is the same time it's negative, from which you then generate everything. I think that is something that my own sort of path of negativity might have more quickly led me to, but it took a while. got there. And I think that is, you know, the dialectical tradition, that is the way you're kind of thinking the relationship between the affirmative and the negative. So it is not, as I said in the talk, you know, I think just saying I'm going to be going like negative as a response, I think even when I did it, I was kind of aware that's a bit kind of, you know, problematic, as I could say. If it's, you know, you are, as people like Nietzsche and Derrida point out, you can become bound to your opposite by just taking the opposite position. So you do need to kind of think through a discourse that can absorb both affirmation and negation within itself, and then grasp the totality. So I think, you know, I guess it was other, you know, not just you, other people pointed out to me at the time, you know, it was something that was absent from that book. And I think trying to make up for that by, like I say, not I still think there is something powerful to the critique of affirmationism. I still think that's kind of right. But at the same time, you do need, I think, then to grasp the relationship between negativity and affirmation, like on the line she suggested, the negation of the negation, which of course is an affirmation then. So that, I think, is partly the point, coming back to the point I said, you can't just have a non-basis, you've got to have a basis, whether you like it or not, which is, again, is a Derridean point. Derrida does say at various points, that classic point, you can't just say, I don't have a basis, that's a kind of empiricism, or that's a kind of, or my basis is radical alterity, or my basis is X or Y. That is still a basis, no matter how much you say it, it kind of doesn't function as one.
So I'm going to ask a couple questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Eventually, just wanted to touch on materialism with you.
Yeah.
So you're returning to Lukács, you agree with his realism, but what do you think is the relationship between realism and materialism? Because Lenin, in his polemic with the Marxists, basically says they're hiding behind this word realism, and it's a kind of cop-out. They're afraid to embrace materialism. So how do you distinguish yourself as a realist and a materialist, and also maybe talk about how you distinguish this kind of realist materialism from other kinds of weird realisms or vitalistic materialisms that have proliferated in the last 20 years or so?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think rereading Lenin, Lenin also talks about what I would call realism, about the kind of reflection theory of ideology. He talks about Marx's stress on understanding the reality of things. It's partly where I drew the quote from, was where he does talk about that. So again, like you say, I think it is a debate about different forms of realism. I certainly agree realism could end up being, as Lukács would call it, a kind of Aesopian word, a code word in a bad way. You can have code words or words you're using to kind of get your arguments across without immediately being kind of shot down or shot, as Lukács risked. But you can kind of introduce further misunderstandings by using a word like realism. Again, I think this would be partly the project I would write. I would say that the realism is related to materialism because it's a realism about material reality. That's its metaphysical commitment. It's not just saying there is a reality out there, there is a material reality out there. That material reality is defined by its contradictory nature, its developmental nature. It is not static, which again answers that sort of question, like, isn't realism just a reproduction of things as they are? Isn't it conservative? This is the sort of debate that Lukács and Brecht have, although of course, Brecht argues that he is more of a realist, because he's not like reproducing the classical bourgeois novel. He says that's the problem with Lukács. So often what you find in those debates, and with Adorno as well, is the debates are really like about who is the most realist, or what are the stakes of realism. So there is more agreement within that than you might imagine, but like you say, a lot turns on how you define what realism is and that relationship to material reality. So I think for realism to be materialist, it's got to grasp there is a monistic reality. That reality is of humans and nature. That reality is generative. That reality is in development. This also relates to the development of freedom and that kind of argument. So reality does have all the dangerous words that I learned to kind of avoid: teleology. It's a reality based on progress, development, totality, teleology, all those things. So they all kind of chain together, and they have to be kind of thought together, which is a bigger project than just this. As to your point, I think it would probably annoy the people who argue for it, but I will do it. I think things like speculative realism and the contemporary realisms indicate like the desire for reality. So, I think you can say it's a positive development. They see the problems in particularly continental philosophy, what Meillassoux calls correlationism, which I think I would relate more strongly to Kant than he relates it to the whole tradition. Includes Hegel in it, includes everyone in it, basically. So I think there was a seeing there that, look, the problem of material reality is a problem. I remember having this thought myself in the 90s, you kind of, what is, if everything's the trace, then what is reality? What is going on in reality? So I don't think I'm the only person to have kind of had this thought and can which in some sense some of my work tries to do, is, can there be a Derridean thinking of this? I tend to think probably not now. So the problem then with speculative realism and weird realisms and things like that is I think they then end up kind of constructing a notion of reality that is, again, that kind of radical alterity, a radical outside. It's oddly sort of Levinasian. I know it's sort of Lovecraft referenced. It becomes, weirdly indefinable, immaterial, chaotic. So precisely sort of beyond rational control. So the irony is, in that case, your realism becomes a realism about reality that doesn't follow laws, tendencies, structures. This is true in Franco Berardi's book, The Third Unconscious. He makes this very clear. It's like reality is fundamentally chaotic. This chaos is resistance to capitalism because it's resistance to value. He has this weird stuff about COVID-19 as like chaotic and beyond control, and it's like, well, thank God it wasn't beyond control. Thank God we came up with vaccines. It's a bit weird to celebrate that chaoticness in the way he does, just on empirical grounds, but also on metaphysical grounds. So I would say that the irony here is that thinkers who claim to be refinding reality in a kind of radically non-human way, instead, to me, generate a reality that becomes kind of oddly inaccessible to humans. And then we're back to all the problems of mediation. So, then it, as in Graham Harman's arguments, it has to become aesthetically kind of perceptible, similar some way in Meyasu, where it has to be perceptible through number. So I just think they're kind of stuck reproducing the same problem, in which reality, as it did in kind of post-structuralism, ends up as a weird thing over there, the outside, the strange, the irreducible. And then you have mediation on the other side. Whereas I would hope a materialist realism or a realist materialism would be precisely about how reality generates its own capacities, including us, for understanding itself and grasping itself. And there are not an opposition between those two.
So this is the first comment in the chat. I totally agree with the critique of polycrisis, obscuring the totality or cause of these crises. At the same time, I wonder if Gerard Vashman's argument that serial crisis is the objectively real totality of our contemporary social hell, that we can't appeal to a totality outside of seriality, but seriality of crisis is the totality itself.
I haven't read the Wackman. I know of him. I think a Lacanian. I think. I guess I would. I'm sorry. I just argued the opposite. So I'm going to argue it again. I think I can see, that argument. But what I would say is, I think totality. Obviously, totality pre-existed capitalist society. Capitalist society is an historical phenomenon that's emerged in world history at a particular point. It's not been there forever. And as Harrison said, we're in the business of, I think, the scientific prediction that it will die in time. There is the classic problem of whether it will be socialism or barbarism. So I do wonder there I would have to read it, but, serial crisis, I can understand, again, it's a kind of reflection on the repetitious nature of crisis as we seem to lurch from crisis to crisis. I would still largely see that as tied to the capitalist mode of production's inability to resolve crisis on its own terms. So it keeps kind of kicking crisis down the road. And the result of keep kicking crisis down the road is that crisis keeps returning in its seriality, as you call it. I guess that's a reference to Sartre. I think I wouldn't like to translate that into the nature of reality. I wouldn't say reality is therefore serial. Reality is therefore a kind of series of, I guess, disjunctive events. Sorry, my memory of Sartre is like, it's the bus queue is serial, isn't it? Things that are kind of aligned but only kind of segmented. I think totality is precisely the thinking of the necessary connection between things, the necessary causal connections. So in that way, crisis or reality couldn't be serial, I don't think, because that would imply too much fragmentation or disconnection. I mean, you could come back at me and say, if we did a causal analysis of crisis and we found out it all wasn't to do with capitalism, that might become a problem for me, yes. But what I'm saying is, I think that you know, that's the explanatory kind of framework. I'm not saying capital, you know, I think that's what I'm trying to avoid, the argument that capitalism is the totality. You know, I think it's a totalizing thing. It's aiming at totality, which is what partly gives us access to the thought and possibility of totality. That's why it's kind of important, world historical, if you like. But I don't think it can be seen as coterminous with totality, because then we kind of make capitalism eternal in a weird way. I think that's my. But like I say, I'd read the Wackman with interest. That sounds interesting.
So, what has your relationship been to Nietzsche as a thinker overall in your intellectual biography? Did you ever consider yourself to be Nietzschean? And how has your critique of accelerationism impacted your views on Nietzsche? And how does it also relate to your reading of Lyserdo's Aristocratic Rebel and Lukács's The Destruction of Reason?
So to do them, as we were discussing before, this biography is, perhaps my biography is never very interesting. There are people out there who lived interesting lives. But Nietzsche was one of the first philosophers I tried to read, and I emphasize tried. I have always struggled in my life with reading philosophy. And I think that's why I appreciate people who teach it and can teach it, because I think it's something that I understand better through being taught than just trying to learn on my own. So like many people, you know, Penguin, God love them, decided to make available large numbers of paperbacks of Nietzsche, not so many paperbacks of Plato or other thinkers. So I had them, tried to read them, didn't really kind of grasp them. Then I read Bataille. Obviously, Bataille is very heavily influenced by Nietzsche. I would probably argue much more than I did. But what attracted me to Bataille was a kind of left thinking. You know, I identified politically as a kind of anarchist or a left winger, and I always found the Nietzschean stuff, you know, just at an intuitive level. I'm not claiming any great insight, as just sort of weird and like, what's this stuff about blonde beasts? And while Kaufman and people, you know, you'd read the introduction and they would say, well, blonde beast doesn't mean blonde beast. It means like something completely different. You'd be like, well, it still seems a weird like metaphor, you know, what's all this stuff about? So, you know, I never found Nietzsche that kind of important to me. Then I was like a Derridean. So, you know, he talks a lot about Nietzsche. And I always thought, I guess, that the kind of ideas that Derrida had about things like difference, you could just do it through Saussure. You know, why did you need Nietzsche? You know, you could just say language is a system of differences without positive terms, which seems to me still to make some kind of sense of the way language works. You don't need all the pathos of Nietzsche, all the kind of aristocratic stuff. So while I now have problems with the thinking of difference, at the time I was always like, I don't understand why you need this. I suppose my reaction to Nietzsche was like, I didn't like its megalomaniacal side. I hadn't really linked it to its politics. Very naive reader of philosophy I am. You know, I hadn't thought, God, this is totally reactionary. I just thought this sounds kind of like weird. You know, why put all this pathos into this stuff? So I never really thought I identified with it. I liked Bataille's kind of critical remarks about Nietzsche and his early work in the 20s, The Old Mole and the prefix sur, I still think is a good article, kind of criticizing Nietzsche and surrealism for its Nietzscheanism. And then I just kind of put it to one side. Like I say, I'm kind of more interested in other thinkers of difference and didn't really think about it. I think what the importance to me of the Lyserdo and the Lukács was really grasping how easy it is to be Nietzschean without even realizing it. So as the bit I mentioned, I think in the talk about this idea of over politicization, I thought this was really kind of fascinating, that kind of politicizing everything in a particular way did not mean you were like Marxist or anarchist, could easily mean you'd kind of reproduced a Nietzscheanism where reality was just sort of tied to a political project. You just dissolved everything in politics. So, you know, there's that kind of argument that you had in theory. So if texts are completely polyvalent, you can read them in any way whatsoever, then we should read them for the left. So the argument was, you know, because any text can be read anyway, therefore we should read them from the left. This was, I think, like a very Nietzschean argument, because the text itself loses any reality. It just becomes an object which you subject to a reading. That reading is not based on any kind of rational analysis or historical merit. It's just like, I think it's that, so that thing, I don't know if you have this, Harrison, but sometimes students say, any reading, it's just a matter of people's subjective opinions, I can read anything like that. So I always, again, had a problem with that, but I didn't realize how much it had kind of entered in to my thinking. If we're going to ground critical thinking, ground critique, then I think we really have to deal with that sort of subjectivist problem that is, I think, a Nietzschean inheritance. So I think the Lassudo book, particularly its discussion of critique, which people don't, I think, get onto. You don't have to read all the stuff at the start. You can skip. I would suggest reading those bits. I think it's really kind of interesting about the way Nietzschean critique differs from Marxist critique. Also, Lukács's The Destruction of Reason, I'd read in the 90s because I, was, again, kind of not happy with the irrationalist kind of elements of post-structuralism. I mean, again, that's one reason I was a Derridean who always seemed, more rationalist. But I really just didn't understand the grounding of Lukács's project. I kind of grasped what he was doing. I thought, yeah, this sounds right. These people seem like, bad. I didn't understand the kind of philosophical commitments. We talked about this. I don't know if you ever did write it, but the piece about reconstructing Lukács's Destruction of Reason should have a volume called Lukács's Reason or Construction of Reason. Well, that's too Deleuzian, but the book implies what reason is that's then being destroyed by these people. I think coming along and reading it, I found it easy to understand like what we would call ideology critique, and I didn't really grasp that, therefore, that had a stronger positive concept of reason. So that's, I guess, where I'm at in kind of reconstructing that. I think to criticize Nietzsche properly and well involves reconstructing like an alternative metaphysical, as you'd say, kind of grounding, a critical grounding that's not Nietzschean. Otherwise, we're just spinning in the same kind of ambit and we're just shouting, louder, again, very Nietzschean, who has the power or who expresses a will to power if you don't like it in subjective terms, becomes a decision, which is what Nietzsche wanted. If power decides everything, then he'd be, as far as I can work out, he'd be kind of happy. So we have to kind of have something better than just that.
Well, a project for a Lukácsian concept of reason is probably going to parallel your own project on Lukácsian realism.
Yeah,
so you're going to have the rational and the real and the real and the rational.
Yeah. I mean, it all connects together. I think that's that's part of the reconstruction. Like you say, with the material as well, because that's also realism can't just float free. Again, this is which I know you can ask me a question about, but because I think you've got a good question about it. But this is the debate about realism not just being like an aesthetic choice. Again, that's how you disable realism. Realism just becomes an option. I could write a realist novel today, or I could write an anti-realist novel, or I could write a Gothic novel, or I could write X or Y. I think there is something more than the aesthetic.
Well, that's the problem with all these empty signifiers, these proper names, what Lenin was addressing in the book on the Marxists. What do you mean by realism? Thomists call themselves realists too. Pragmatists call themselves realists. Nietzscheans and Heideggerians can call themselves realists. And of course, today, people call themselves materialists and people call themselves Marxists. And you really don't know what they mean.
Yeah.
So, it's
so as we've said, it's, which I'm sure I've been guilty of at various points, but it is like, the ability to articulate what are the commitments that you have to those things and what those commitments mean, as we can talk about, only because we're not no way an expert on Aquinas, but Aquinas is famous for a moderate realism, and the people who are more radically realist get burned outside the University of Paris. So that's partly, again, the debate about, and obviously Aquinas is criticized by the Catholic Church for being a realist. Aquinas is kind of out for quite a long period. So I think there's something interesting there about, even within those debates or claims made to realism, there is something that tells us about the contentiousness of that position within, I guess we could call bourgeois ideology or state philosophy or whatever, theological or, the historical domain.
I think there's a parallel to be made the relationship between Aquinas's relationship to Islamic philosophy
Yeah.
as a kind of passive revolution, that he's
Yeah.
appropriating certain aspects from the Islamic world, from the School of Toledo, and then moderating them. And I think there's a reason why Hegel's called the Protestant Aquinas, because I think German idealism does that with the French Revolution.
Yeah. Yeah. That would be, yeah.
So I have a question about political economy. So I'm getting really material here.
Yes.
Where do you stand? This is a big question. Where do you stand when it comes to issues of political economy, and what do you still think is relevant or necessary about Marx's critique of capitalism? And maybe to narrow this down, we can talk about your reaction to techno-feudalist, neo-feudalist interpretations that claim we aren't even living under capitalism anymore, but something worse.
Yeah. So I guess I think, as I mentioned, in Jodie's book, which I found interesting read, and it's the moderated version, coming back to like moderate realism of Aquinas. It's the moderated version of the thesis, because Jodie is careful to argue that it's not saying capitalism is over, but something is emerging. She would argue that is not capitalism, but is neo-feudalism. So I guess, as I said in the talk, I think I would still argue that those tendencies are still capitalist, and they are expressive of capital's inability to resolve current contradictions on their own terms. So the kind of some of the things that people who analyze techno-feudalism point to, like the extraction of value through rent, I think are just attempts to desperately answer problems about value extraction through labor, value extraction in the kind of quote unquote normal capitalist mode. Some of the symptoms of concentration of authority, some of the kind of analysis that she does, which I think was resonant to me. You kind of do. Did everyone watch Game of Thrones and decided it would be a great idea we lived that way? It wasn't the lesson I took from Game of Thrones. But, so people unironically use the phrase bend the knee. And unironically bend the knee. So you do, some of the chapters that she has about the kind of, if you like, the texture of contemporary capitalist life, you can see it does feel like that. And I have some sympathy, although I'd have a slightly different account, that is something to do with the failure of success of the left, the weakness of the left is some way in which obviously those bad solutions can get worse. But I still think we live in a capitalist society. I still think capitalism is contradictory. I don't think capitalism can resolve its own problems. I think capitalism, has an inevitable logic of kind of collapse. I think I'm not a political economist, so I'm not an expert on this as I should be. But I think the things Marx argues about labor theory of value, tendency of profit to fall, I still think that they are probably true, or I know they've been disputed since the moment Marx published Capital, or signed off, literally the moment it was out. All those tendencies were kind of criticized, but I think they hold good. And I think without holding to something like that, I think it's very hard to understand the present. And I think we are in danger, as I sort of answered to that serial crisis question, we're in danger of almost kind of turning capital into something more important than it is. We are making it coterminous with life. We are making it coterminous with totality. We're making it coterminous with the world. By describing it as hell, it's accurate in one sense, but as again we've discussed, if you don't think hell without the purgatorio and the paradisio, I don't think you're kind of thinking it. And I think, if we're trying to think anything, it's got to be, you do exit hell in the weird way he does, and then you do go through the purgatorio, as Marx says, and the book Marx's Inferno acknowledges, and then we have to kind of move towards the paradiso. So that's not going to be easy. That's not kind of a given exactly. That's a necessity that has to be played out. But I think without some of those kind of things, then we are in danger of abandoning the discourse that we're aiming for. So that's my kind of answer. I think the techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism arguments I would say, point to the current depth of the contradictions or crisis of capital itself. They don't point to a new mode of production.
So moving on to some pieces in your book on Fischer and Jameson. You have two pieces devoted to Mark Fisher and the late Fred Jameson, respectively. So can you talk more about Fisher and Jameson as theorists? Do you see divergences, overlap between the two? Do you see a connection between Fisher's critique of capitalist realism and Jameson's focus on allegory, or even Fisher's acid communism and Jameson's approach to utopia?
Yeah, I mean, I think just for people who haven't read the book, there's a little section on kind of thinkers, of which Mark and Frederick Jameson are two. There's another couple. And those are based on pieces I'd published, like all the essays, things published before. I did rewrite them for the book. And I think in both cases, I rewrote them in a more critical way than they had initially been published, although I still think there's probably more critical things that could be said. So I guess that would be just a first point. I think I would probably develop a more critical line than I did. Although, of course, there is the human thing that Mark passed in tragic circumstances, and Frederick Jameson just passed away and made an important, massive contribution to our understanding of the world, and Mark in his own way as well. So, it's I wouldn't rush in at this moment in a sense, but I think we do owe their thinking and understanding and critique. That's not disrespectful to what people have done. To do that. So yeah, I think they do share a lot in common. Obviously Mark's work is influenced by Zizek, I think, which is quite clear when you reread it. And at the time, and Zizek is also kind of working like with Jamesonian tropes, the confusion of the quote that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, which everyone says, is it X or Y or Z? It's quite clearly Jameson. Unless someone can point to something else. I think it's in Jameson book from the 90s that's got the essay on Platonov in it, whose name I can't remember for some reason, tired. So it's quite clearly Jameson who says it first, then it's quoted by Mark, and then it's quoted by Zizek. So one of my many eternal frustrations with the world of the internet is quote attribution. And now, thanks to AI, we'll never know. So they share that kind of common background. There is a common kind of sense, like you say, of the utopian in response to capitalist society. So I think one of the things that Mark does well in capitalist realism is describe like the kind of some of the lived reality of capitalist society. The problem I have with that is, I think, relates to his kind of deluzianism and his sort of Landianism, is that his description of coming back to capitalism as hell is too kind of undialectical, it's too monological. So the gain is like you come up with a very resonant description of capitalist society, but the problem is you find it hard to imagine anything beyond that. And then when you do imagine something beyond that, it's very detached. So firstly, we get the kind of, in Mark Fisher, the emphasis on the weird and the weird fiction and stuff, which I share his taste in liking that as fiction, but I don't think it's a good way to imagine like the outside, as he calls it, of capital. The two things end up very much detached from each other. Similarly, I think with acid communism, without obviously, that's part of the tragedy, we won't know. But it seems strange to me that Mark, who had always been a kind of resolute critic of like 60s counterculture, was always like, I'm more punk than hippie, there's that sort of strain in his work, should then turn kind of to that stuff, to turn back to the psychedelic almost without understanding his own criticism of it. I think I would have been more convinced if it's like, it'd been more about like, I thought this was wrong, but I was wrong. And it's right. It didn't, the fragments that we have, at least the fragments I've read, don't do much of that self-criticism. And then, of course, the other problem is going back to, it's just another version of a sort of psychedelic outside. It's a kind of, we could reprogram ourselves. We need to reprogram our brains. If capitalism has kind of shaped our neurological substrate, then the only way out of it is some kind of brain rearrangement. And I suppose what I do think, often capitalism does shape our intimate behaviors in quite kind of strong ways that we don't always think about. Evidence suggests that most people form intimate relationships with people who are about the same class fraction. It's like we often, whatever our dreams of romantic love are, we don't tend to kind of fall into relationships outside of our class background. So I'm not saying capital doesn't shape us quite intimately, but I don't think it's like down to the level of the kind of brain structure. It's not that deep. So I think the problem with capitalist realism is that it's not realist enough about capitalism. It doesn't understand, the realism there is negative entirely. Capitalism is the realism. There's no other alternative reality except this kind of psychedelic. And then similarly, at least, with Jameson, which I always have to be careful because so much came out, so much to read. I think the similar problems with the utopian in his work, where the utopian comes to seem very unspecified. He literally says that everything has a utopian dimension, which he goes all the way. Fascism has a utopian dimension, everything. So then I think you're back in a problem. So what makes a good one then? What's a bad one? How are we supposed to distinguish between, visions of the collective? Obviously, we don't want fascist visions of the collective. Even if they're utopian, we must think they're bad. So how do we articulate that? How do we analyze that? And I think the abstractness of that utopian solution, like the abstractness of the psychedelic or the weird in Marx's work, I think leaves us more problems. It's like, again, a kind of imaginary escapist outside. So, that's my problem. I guess going back to your point about allegory, I think again, kind of reality is displaced by proliferating allegories. There's never, while Jameson does talk about realism, and he is one of the things I was thinking of. He talks, made me think about realism. I think when you look at his work, it's not as strongly realist as I would think it should be. I think it's peculiarly unrealist in its own way, and that's, again, I guess, a sort of answer to in both cases. You've got a book called Capitalist Realism, where realism is only capitalist, and you've got a project for realism where realism seems to kind of, at least in his recent book, disappear into the kind of affective and the emotional in a kind of strange way. We seem to lose a kind of realism of reality.
You mentioned Zizek, so we have a question in the chat that invokes his name.
Yes.
Could you say more on the notion of non-alienated life, perhaps in relation to Zizek's distinction between constitutive transhistoric alienation in the symbolic language, etc., and constituted, historically specific alienation in capitalism? Zizek also criticizes the perspective that the latter could be overcome, but not the former, as an ideological distortion made possible by capitalism itself.
Yeah, I guess I'm just trying to write something which is a very indirect way of doing this, but I want to write something that's more direct way of doing this. I think this distinction just doesn't stand up. And I think I'm trying to kind of write something against the whole idea of what I called an irreducible alienation, or what he would call a constitutive alienation. So I think a non-alienated life, which we can imagine in various ways, as you, Harrison, pointed me to. There's a good Bertil Ullmann piece on this. It's a life where we get to meet our needs, where our needs are not mediated by the market, where we get fulfilling work, where we get fulfilling relationships. We don't live in fear, as we do in capitalist society. We get generous amounts of leisure time. We get generous amounts of capacity for self-development. All the kind of things that we do. I think that's thing that, is, as Ullmann says, there's more in Marx than you would imagine, and it's clearer in Marx than you would think. you know, our metabolism with nature, our collective self-production, all that stuff, the non-alienated life stuff, I think can not just overcome capitalist alienation, but also does potentially offer ways through other forms of alienation. You know, we are aiming at a society that would overcome some of the other forms of what Zizek would call constitutive alienation. So I think, which is something I haven't yet worked out, but you know, that kind of idea that there is an irreducible alienation is firstly strikes me as very religious. You know, it's sort of Lutheran, Pascalian, Augustinian. You know, whatever we do, we're fallen. You know, whatever we do, there's something bad about us. There's something wrong. I don't think that's kind of true. I think humans are fundamentally good. So I have a problem at that level. Also, I think it's a way to avoid like what they would call kind of totalitarianism again. So this fear of totality, which they equate to the totalitarian. If there is something fundamentally alienated and negative about me, I can never be absorbed. You know, there's always some leftover or remnant that cannot be kind of fixed. So, you know, again, I suppose I'm not pleading for totalitarianism, but I think why is this has to be negative? You know, why is there something irreducibly kind of faulty? And then when you look at those formulations, like a Lacan about our experience in language or Derrida about experience in language, you know, Derrida, I think, calls it like a non-alienated alienation or an alienation without alienation, because it doesn't really make sense to call it alienation because alienation implies that you could have it another way. You can't really in their own thinking. So it's peculiar that they add this pathos of calling it alienation. You know, I think I was reading someone talking about Derrida's book, Monolingualism, with the other, where they said he talks about like exile in language. What sense does that make? You know, why use the term exile? Why not just use inhabiting language or, you know, the opposite? Because either term makes as much sense. So I guess, you know, a series of unpopular views. I think we might be worth think about not appealing to irreducible alienation and to think about the overcoming of that as part of the condition of what we want to achieve. Which is, you know, not to say there isn't going to be anything negative in the future. You know, this is the kind of blackmail of these positions. You know, you know, obviously, you know, I don't think all human psychopathology is reducible to capitalism or all human illness, or, you know, people had problems. People will have problems. It's not a kind of irreducibility of problems. But I don't think calling that constitutive alienation adds very much to one's conception of humans and human possibilities and development and needs. So, yeah, I need to work on it. But I think I'm not happy with that way of thinking about things.
I know I didn't articulate this question, but I'm curious after your response to the Zizek question. How do you feel that your relationship is to Lacanian psychoanalysis now?
More critical than it has been. So I think there are some important things. You know, the way I learned Lacan, which is the way he does his teaching, is there's a series of solutions to problems in Freud. And, you know, the solutions he comes up with to problems in Freud, I don't think are like bad. You know, like, so the classical problem in Freud is like, how do you get the ego? Where does the ego come from? Does it just spontaneously develop? You know, where is it rooted? And Lacan's solution is the imaginaries. You know, so it comes from our interrelationship with others, our series of reflected images. That does lead us back to problems about alienation, which, you know, I think is a problem. But, or, you know, how do we think about castration? How do we think about the, you know, if castration seems to be culturally relative, you know, the whole kind of anthropological critique of Freud, you know, historical critique of Freud, do we have to point to people literally saying, I'm going to castrate you? How do we understand that? Lacan's answer that it's about our relationship to language does seem like a kind of rational solution to that. You know, it's like, it's a fairly, you know, again, there are debates and there are problems with that, but it's a fairly universal position. So I think there are still kind of things interesting in Lacan as solutions or ways of thinking about psychoanalysis, because that raises the even bigger question, you know, do we want to keep psychoanalysis? I kind of still feel it's important. But as you've said, I'd have to rationally reconstruct that, not just assert it. Sorry, something flashed up on the screen, confusing me. So I think the problem with Lacan that I see is some of the ways in which his thought gets translated into philosophy, and some of the metaphysical dimensions in particular, like the symbolic imaginary real. I think those things are vital to Lacanian thought, kind of constitutive of it, but I still do wonder how they stand up. And obviously when you talk to Lacanians, or Lacanians make their arguments, they're aware of some of these problems, and they would argue like, well, we're not really saying that, or what we mean by that is not that. That's what they'd say. But I am concerned that there is a potential irrationalism in Lacanianism, and whether that is, if you like, a contingent irrationalism, there's a way to reconstruct Lacan on more rational lines, or it's a constitutive, sorry to use that word in this context, irrationalism, I think is something to be settled and debated. I think while there have been many critiques of Lacan and many kind of instances of, how do you say that word, apostasy, kind of people leaving Lacanianism, I think it would be interesting to have a stronger, more rationalist critique. One of the other projects that I'll probably never do, but interested me, is like Marxist critiques of Freud, looking back at Christopher Caldwell's critique, or Voloshinov's critique, or Trotsky's remarks, or Lukács's remarks, the debates in the 20s and 30s. So I think it would be interesting to go back to that again, so not, Foucault has that famous remark about Marx and Freud in the same incandescent light. Less the synthesis and more the critical interrogation. But I think it's Sebastiano Timpanaro says you can know a Western Marxist because the one thing they are committed to is the belief in Freud above everything else. Funny no one quotes that in their critiques of Western Marxism. Kind of true, in my case, kind of true.
So, moving on to the party.
Mm-hmm.
How do you understand the party form? And how is this related to your criticisms of communization and autonomism? What role do Lenin, Trotsky, and Lukács play in your thinking about the party? And how can thinking about the party form help us to avoid problems of opportunism and sectarianism?
Yeah, again, something I come to recently, and it's not an excuse. Well, it's an excuse, but I think the classical problem of the party is still with us. I don't think that problem's gone away. While I have some problems with how Jodie formulates it in Crowds and Power, I think she's right about the need to think about the party, and I think Badiouian type arguments about the post-party form are premature unless they're like, we need to think about it. Sure. So I think the party, which is something I hadn't thought about, partly because I came from a sort of more anarchist position, partly because certain ways in which left parties worked in Britain didn't really impress me very much. Part of the working through the party form is working through the fact that there have been many attempts in the world to formulate kind of what a Bolshevik party would look like in different conditions under different forms, and those attempts have not on the whole gone well. But again, that's the kind of task that confronts us. I think the party is important as a collective mediator of knowledge. Again, it's not just individuals. We have including me, we have a very individualist mode of thinking about knowledge. It's star thinkers, big names. Like we're saying, not everyone can do everything, unless certain people are. I think what we tend to call geniuses. Some people are just incredibly good thinkers. But how will we collectively mediate our knowledge and understanding of the world? And I think the party is still something that we need to do that. I was talking to someone about AI and social media and stuff like that. We're bombarded with ideology, if you like, or disruptive kind of forms of pseudo knowledge, I would call them, this kind of that serial metaphor, just stuff. I mean, something like the party or the party form is partly there to mediate that, so we're not just bombarded with this stuff, and we don't just sort of take it on board, and people don't become radicalized immediately into anti-vaxxers or into people who believe strange things. This is again the mechanisms that even bourgeois society had to avoid that, like through schooling and stuff, have broken down. Capitalist society is rupturing its own conditions of kind of possibility, it seems to me. I'm not saying, and that's partly, as the contradictions exacerbate, kind of Lenin's type way, then, the need for alternative forms becomes pressing. So I think partly, I don't know how exactly you would imagine it, but, Lenin's emphasis on the newspaper, the fact he writes so many articles, as I say in my piece, he's rationally trying to justify it. He's not just saying it's a weird leap, the April thesis, not just, people say Lenin's gone mad, he's kind of, and people like Zizek pick up on this, but it's not, Lenin is concerned to argue why he's made that position, to establish that position within the party. And if he can't be successful at doing that, then that position wouldn't have been accepted. Lenin at that point doesn't have a load of armed men around him. He's not going in forcing his position onto people through violence. He has to convince, persuade, and convince people his analysis is going to work, and then it has to work. So I guess that stuff is still important, and that stuff is still, I think, before us as a problem. Like I say, I'm not saying, again, returning to debates, there aren't debates about how we would formulate that, what we mean by that, looking at the existing kind of forms and their inadequacies is not like, important. Again, things that we might have thought have been historically surpassed, like Stalinism, are they that surpassed? Cults of personality, are they that surpassed? People, including me, jokingly refer to people like Bob Avakian, but these modes seem to be problems that are recurrent, so we'd have to kind of deal with that. But I think that's what I would say, I guess, that it's the collective is important. Sorry, very banal point, but the party as the organized expression of that collectivity.
So moving to
Your Lukács project, Realism. So I asked you a question about realism and materialism, but this is more realism when it refers to art and culture. And you have Eagleton and Jameson appropriate the term realism, but Eagleton once said that realism in culture and art doesn't have to subscribe to a particular optic. And this seemed to leave his approach to realism vague and arguably indeterminate. So I want to ask, how does your approach to realism after Lukács distinguish itself from Eagleton's or Jameson's realism? And what kind of space is there for non-representational art, fantasy, in a realist aesthetic framework? And what if, let's say, horror, for instance, or sci-fi or speculative fiction, will these be considered inferior art forms if we subscribe to a Marxist realism that Brecht mocked Lukács for as wanting to simply just reproduce Balzac but better?
Yeah. Temptation is to say yes, which I think is true, but I will expand. Yeah, I mean, I think firstly the optic thing and Eagleton's, which I might use for the introduction, if you read people read his recent piece, I think in the LRB, where he talks about Marx aesthetic based around that book Verso published. Sorry, I can't think of the writer, but I've read it. This is the problem of realism as just an option. I think if realism is just an aesthetic option that we should sort of prefer, but as Eagleton says, well, we also like modernism, so we kind of like to keep that, then I don't think that is a strong enough version of realism. And I think it is not a strong enough version of Marxist aesthetics. It kind of just dissipates into choice, which, okay, but it's not a kind of aesthetic argument. And not, I guess, a philosophical argument, because realism, I think, has to be an assertion that there are certain modes of perception and knowledge, including aesthetic, that are better or worse at approaching reality. So therefore, there is an assessment element in it. It is saying there are better or worse ways to approach reality. So to come back to your point, I'm just rereading Clive Barker's Books of Blood. I like horror fiction. I think they're good. Part of the reason I think they're good is they're kind of realist. He does interesting things about grounding them in 1980s reality. Sorry, this is a weird real aside, but it's my stream. So if you've seen the film Hellraiser, one of the great things about Hellraiser is its kind of portrait of seedy 80s Britain, which I think is an unmatched portrait of that kind of world. So even within those kind of representations, I think we still make particular claims about realism. Obviously, you can look at, Lukács says, like E.T.A. Hoffmann, the great German romantic and writer of ghost stories, he says he's a better capturer of reality in Germany than like other more realist German novelists, because he captures the weirdness of Germany's delayed, fractured development. So you can make a kind of argument at that level. Horror fiction captures the reality of capitalism because capitalism is horror. But again, something I'm going to work on, but I do think there is still a problem with that, because capitalist horror isn't horror like that. Isn't horror like horror in reality. I was thinking this today about Andor. I haven't seen Andor because I'm too cheap to pay for Disney Plus. And everyone loves Andor. It sounds good. And it's written by the guy who writes the Bourne things. And it's a political thriller about Star Wars, in the Star Wars universe. And I was thinking, well, would it be better if it was just a political thriller set in our universe? Or, is it gaining by being set in the Star Wars universe? Obviously it gains in the sense of complicating that Star Wars universe. So it goes from being a moral binary universe of black and white into a universe where you can understand why the Empire is successful, why resistance is horrible and difficult, and the necessity for revolutionary change. So there is a kind of gain in that. But, at the same time, I guess I'm still wondering, is it a sort of displacement of those problems from our world into a world where they seem more possible? Is it still escapist, I guess, is the baseline. So, my guess is that I think the argument would be that forms like fantasy, horror, which some people would argue is a subset, horror, fantasy, science fiction, which I like a lot, are not as good as classical realism in grasping the dynamics of reality. And therefore they are not as good modes of knowledge or understanding of that reality. So like most things, I don't think it's saying there would be no, ruling out the publication of those things. I don't think it's, saying, but I think it would be saying that if you want to understand and grasp social change, those things are not as successful as realist things. You can read them for other reasons. You can read them, like I read Clive Barker, I think, because I want to understand how weird bodies are and like how weird we, the relationship of humans to their own transformations are. He's a great writer of bodily transformation, I think. And as a queer writer, I think he's, very much committed to that. And I think, he tells me something about that level of human reality, that reality that we've got these weird bodies that do weird things. But yeah, I think that is a problem still. I think realism might make that claim. So,
do we have enough time for one more question?
Mm-hmm.
Because there is one more
more
question in the chat. So let's ask it. I agree with you, Ben. Let's see. Sorry, the chat function on this platform limits the possibility to expand a question. Crisis, seriality in capitalism is an absolutely imminent critique of itself, but it is structured seriality, or seems to be. Analyzing that imminent totality of structure of the repetition compulsion of crisis is crucial to not escaping to some great doors. Thank you so much.
Yeah, that's kind. Yeah, I mean, thank you to the people listening as we're sort of wrapping up. Thank you to Harrison, Panegyrius, Alex, and Sebastian again, and to all of you who've listened and your comments. Yeah, platforms like this suck. As I was saying before, it's like talking into the air, you know, it's like communicating into this really weird device of which you are both are and are not connected to a range of other human beings. You know, not that, you know, live talks don't have their problems. You know, it's not like there's a magical solution. So not like all mediation is bad. You know, sometimes it's good. I'm at home, I can do this without leaving my home. I can go and eat in a minute, which I will go and do. So there are some advantages to this, as can you. So yeah, I mean, I think if I understand the quote, you know, this is what I suppose I've been arguing, that in line with what Lukács says, again, but not just because he's Lukács, but because I think it's important, you know, he says we need to grasp not just the appearance of capitalist crisis, but its essence. And I guess that comes back to your point, Harrison, about realism. We're trying to grasp the essence of things, their fundamental structures, their causal relations. And again, that also relates to the party form. You know, we're not necessarily saying we all need to do this on our own. You know, how do we kind of grasp those things? And if we do, I think that is an important way of expanding, like as Spinoza would say, you know, expanding our capacities for freedom, like through our understanding of necessity, not against our understanding of necessity. As Freud also, I think, you know, that's one of Freud's Spinozist kind of things. You know, he's saying that if we can, you know, understand what the determinants that make us what we are, then that gives us a capacity to kind of change those determinants. Or as Marx says, you know, people make history not under conditions of their own making, but because we do, those conditions are also transformable. In fact, they're being transformed all the time, just in ways that are not in our control. So one of the fundamental aims of the revolutionary politics, is the seizure of the means of production, is the seizure of the fundamental, and the state, the fundamental mechanisms that do leave us alienated and out of control of our lives. And I think, you know, that's what I think is the most important thing, I guess, that we can think about, is the collective need for that, you know, to re-establish, regain, develop, and understand our freedom through our understanding of necessity and through our capacities to collectively, you know, grasp those things. Because at the moment, we live in a world where most things are out of our control. You know, we are bombarded by information, events, you know, happenings, troubles of all sorts, and good things as well. You know, it's a mixed bag of things, but that lack of control, I think, leaves us very vulnerable and exposed. So that's what we need to do, overcome that alienation and fragmentation. And on that note,
thank you so much, Ben.
Say good night to you all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for everyone who attended,
And thanks so much to the HM organizers. And see you all later.
Thanks, guys.